So then, here's a young woman. She's dedicated to her family. She's raising her kids, and she's having a great life, living the dream. And all of a sudden, her husband comes home and says, "Listen, I'm moving to Buenos Aires with my 2 secretaries." Now, the woman goes through the normal emotional reactions. She feels anger, she feels resentment, she feels jealousy, she feels envy, she feels victimization. Now, what she doesn't know is that every time she recalls that event in her brain, she's producing the same chemistry in the brain and the body as if the event was happening. And as she continues to do it, she keeps teaching her body to live in the past. And her body begins to believe that she's in the same experience over and over again. And as those emotions begin to run and she begins to recall the event begins to create that refractory period, and it turns into a mood, and then she keeps it going for months, and it turns into a temperament. She keeps it going for years, and it turns into a personality trait. And she does this for 20 years. And you come up to her 20 years later and you say, "Why are you this way? Why are you so angry? Why are you so bitter? Why are you so resentful?" And what do you think she's going to say? "I am this way because of this thing that happened to me 20 years ago," which really means I'm stuck to my past and I haven't changed in the last 20 years. Would you agree? And I was altered from that event and I haven't been able to make my way back. Okay? Another woman raising her family, living the dream with her, raising her children, happily married. All of a sudden, her husband comes home and says, "I'm moving to the south of France with my 2 secretaries and the mailman." And she goes through the same emotional reaction as the other lady. But all of a sudden, she realizes living by this emotion isn't loving to her. And if she really loved her ex-husband, truly loved him, she would set him free. So she begins to read books about unconditional love, and she begins to fire and wire new circuits in her brain. She begins to establish networks of neurons to reflect this new mind. She contemplates on it and thinks about it, reinforces the circuits. Then she begins to apply what she learns. And she raises those children by herself. She takes them to all their competitive events and ballet. She goes to school in the evenings. She goes to work during the day. She graduates from college. She gets a new job at a successful company. 2 years later, she falls in love with the senior vice president. He travels the world and he takes her with her. 3 years later, they buy a home in the south of France, close to her ex-husband. Then her children graduate college and they get married and she has grandchildren, and you approach her 20 years later and you say to her, "Well, didn't your husband leave you 20 years ago?" What do you think she's going to say? "That was the best thing that ever happened to me." What's the difference? You see, one person was defined by the experience and she could never overcome the emotion. That became her identity. The other person transmuted the emotion into something else and she began to change because of it. See, we are defined by our adversity. And so, imagine a person who's living in a state of suffering like that first woman for 20 years, thinking and feeling in the same cycle. Those feelings are, she can't think greater than how she feels. She's thinking in the past. She's signaling the same gene over and over again by the same emotion, keeping the same gene turned on. And all of a sudden, she decides to change after 20 years of this. Now remember, the body has become the mind. The servant is now the master. And so all of a sudden, she shows back up on the scene and she says, "Today, no more complaining, no more blaming, no more making excuses, no more talking about anybody else, no more self-pity. I'm just going to stop today." What do you think the body's going to say? Where you been? I've been doing this for the last 20 years. You've programmed me to be this way. I've even modified my receptor sites. For you, I'm the servant to you. And the body is going to be, as it begins to become the mind, it's going to send signals back to the brain. Because now she's beginning to break that chemical continuity because she's not thinking the same way, she's not acting the same way, she's not feeling the same way. And that breaking that chemical cycle is so unfamiliar. And you can't predict the next feeling when you're outside the box. So then all of a sudden, as she begins to no longer signal the same emotional genes in the same way, the body begins to send information back up through the spinal cord, right up to the thinking brain. I call that the fast track. Now at the same time, chemical levels of suffering are dropping because she's no longer thinking and feeling in the same cycle. And there's a thermostat in your brain called the hypothalamus. And that hypothalamus all of a sudden begins to sense chemical levels of suffering are going down. And it sends a signal to the thinking brain. That's called the slow track. And the next thing you know, she starts to hear these voices in her head. You know those voices? The ones that say, why don't you start tomorrow? Tomorrow's a better day. Today's a good day to suffer. You're so much like your mother, you'll never change. What's wrong with me? Nobody loves me. And of course, my favorite one is, this doesn't feel right. Now, the moment we respond to those sub-vocalizations, that chatter, consciousness immerses itself right back into the program, and we return to thinking the same thoughts, performing the same actions, and living by the same emotions, but really expecting something to change in our life. How many people are with me? So then, we have this faculty as human beings. It's called metacognition. We can think about how we think. It's kind of unique. We can pay attention to how we feel. We can notice how we're acting and behaving. And because we can become conscious of those unconscious states, it means that we could modify our behaviors to do a better job in life. And that's called neuroplasticity, that the brain can actually physically and chemically change when you change your consciousness, that the brain begins to reorganize itself to reflect a new level of mind. How many people are with me? So we have three brains in one, that allow us to go from thinking to doing to being. Now, your thinking brain is your neocortex. It's that corrugated walnut on the outside with all the folds, and it's on the outside. It's the newest and most evolved part of the human brain and nervous system. It's the most neuroplastic also. And every time you learn something new, you make a new connection in your thinking brain. You're listening to me right now with your neocortex, your thinking brain. Now, once you begin to learn new information, you read the book on how to ride a bicycle, how to build a doghouse, you read a book on how to dance the salsa, you read a book on how to knit, you read a book on how to be a better parent, how to cook Mandarin cuisine. All of this information is stored in your thinking brain. Now, when you take what you intellectually, philosophically, theoretically learned, and you apply it, you personalize it, you demonstrate it, it means you're going to have to modify your behavior in some way and do something different. And if you alter your actions and do something differently, would you agree now you're going to have a new experience? Now, when you're in the midst of that experience, all that vital information is rushing back to your brain, and when it reaches the brain, it reinforces the circuits you learned intellectually, it enriches them, and then the second brain turns on, called the limbic brain, or the emotional brain, or the chemical brain. It's about the size of a lemon, and it sits right underneath it. So you read the book on how to be a great parent. As a matter of fact, you're so inspired by it that you read it twice. And you go to the parent study groups and you talk about everything that you learned in the book, and then you see the DVD and your brain is firing and wiring all this information in there. And all of a sudden, one day, Your son comes home with his 3 friends, and they're about ready to bust through the front door with muddy shoes. And you are going to turn into a raging maniac. And all of a sudden, you see him coming around the corner, and you step back, and you want to say those things and act in old programmed ways. And you take a breath, and you step back, and you begin to observe those thoughts. You begin to notice those behaviors. You begin to become aware of those feelings that drive you to a lower denominator. And the fact that you can observe those states of mind and body means you're no longer the program, but the consciousness observing the program. And as you begin to become conscious of those unconscious states, your frontal lobe turns on and begins to quiet down the circuits in your brain that are connected to the old self. And nerve cells that no longer fire together, no longer wire together. You begin to settle down the circuits in your brain that are connected to the old mind. Now, as you're sitting there taking your breath, you begin to think about and contemplate what you learned in the book. And as you begin to think about it, you begin to make your brain fire in new sequences, and new patterns, and new combinations. And as you begin to think about what you learned, you begin to naturally rehearse a new way of being, and you put yourself into the equation. In other words, you begin to picture yourself how you're going to apply all this knowledge. And as you begin to imagine a new way of being, and you fire and wire those new circuits in new ways, you're beginning to neurologically install the hardware ahead of the actual experience. So now you have circuits in place because you've warmed your brain up. And as you begin to fire and wire those new circuits and create a new level of mind, you're beginning to install that hardware. You walk out into the living room, and you see your son, and you take a breath, and you say, why don't you guys go around the garage? I'll have some hot chocolate for you guys and some cookies. Slip your shoes up, strip down. I'll have some sweats for all you guys. And you do exactly what the book says. As you begin to get your behaviors to match your intentions, as you get your actions equal to your thoughts, as you get your mind and body working together, you have a new experience. And the moment you have that new experience, that limbic brain turns on, and you feel like a good parent. And the moment you feel like a good parent, you are teaching your body emotionally to understand what your mind is intellectually understood. You see, knowledge is for the mind, but experience is for the body. And as the body begins to get a new emotional signal, you are literally turning on new genes and new ways, because you're beginning to embody knowledge. It's new information coming from the environment, and you're literally rewriting the program. How many people are with me? But it's not enough to do it once. You can't demonstrate being a good parent once and then expect to be canonized as a saint. You have to be able to repeat the experience over and over again. You have to be able to do it so many times, repeat it so many times, that you neurochemically condition your body to memorize patience or compassion or good parenting as well as your conscious mind. And whenever your body knows as well as your mind, or your mind and body are one, you activate that third brain called the cerebellum, the seat of your subconscious. In other words, you've done it so many times, you don't even have to think about it any longer. Your body can do it on its own. It's now subconscious. It's automatic. It's second nature. It's innate in you because you've practiced it so many times that you neurologically and chemically taught your body or trained your body how to do it on its own. When you're in that state of being, we could say now you've memorized an internal chemical order that nothing in your environment can move you from it. No person, no thing, no experience. How many people are with me? In other words, you know how you do it, but you don't even know how you know how. So how many people here know someone who's memorized suffering? Doesn't have to be you, it could be anybody. And you say to that person, hey, did you read the book I gave you? What do they say? No. Did you see the DVD I gave you? Oh, no. Hey, listen, we're going to go out to dinner. We're going to go see some stand-up comedy. We're going to go for a walk along the water. You want to come? No. What are they saying? I'm insisting on this neurochemical order that no person, no thing, no experience can move us from it. And we have these three brains to allow us to move into a new state of being. And the quantum field, universal mind, whatever you want to call it, responds to who you're being. Not what you're thinking, not what you're feeling, but the combination of how you're thinking and how you're feeling, called a state of being. So there was an experiment done a little ways back where they took a group of people that were expert prayers. And they took these 3 vials of DNA, and they set these 3 vials of DNA in front of these expert prayers. And prayer is a skill, just like golf or tennis. The more you practice it, the better you get at it. And they said to these expert prayers, with all of your intention is just getting clear on what you want. It's a cognitive process. It's a thought process. With all of your thought and intention, we want you to see this DNA winding and unwinding, winding and unwinding, winding and unwinding. They practiced it over and over again, over and over again. At the end of the experiment, when they checked the DNA, guess what happened? Nothing. Intention did absolutely nothing to change the DNA. So then they took another group of expert prayers and they said, okay, what we want you to do now is we want you to move into an elevated mood. We want you to feel goodwill and joy. And we want you to feel loving kindness. And we want you to radiate this emotion out into the field and just keep doing it over and over again. And at the end of the experiment, they checked the DNA and guess what happened? Nothing. An elevated emotion like love or compassion did nothing to change the DNA. But when they said to these people, okay, we want you to get very clear in your mind on seeing this DNA either winding or unwinding, and then we want you to move into an elevated emotion of how you would feel if the DNA unwound. Give thanks for it unwinding before it actually unwound. Guess what happened? 25% of the DNA unwound. You see, the thoughts that you think are the electrical charge in the quantum field. And the feelings that you emote are the magnetic charge in the quantum field. And how you think and how you feel broadcasts an electromagnetic signature that influences every single atom in your life. The thought sends the signal out, and the feeling draws the event back. Now, what are you broadcasting every day? Because what you are broadcasting, you are asking the quantum field to manifest in a way that you would least expect, that surprises you. So if you're walking around in a state of guilt or suffering, you are basically saying, okay, quantum field, bring me an event in my life equal to how I'm feeling and bring it in a way that I could experience more guilt. But listen, surprise me. Make it unusual. Make it different. And leave no doubt that it came from you so that I'm inspired to keep doing this. So then, karma. We live the same lifetime every day. We're not punished for our sins, we're punished by our sins. Because as we stay in the same state of being, thinking and feeling in the same way, we keep creating the same experiences over and over again. Unmemorize the emotion, change your state of being, and the karma no longer exists. How many people are with me? So what if you woke up in the morning and you said to yourself, what is the greatest ideal of myself that I can be today? Instead of getting out of bed and doing the same things and thinking the same thoughts and creating the same experiences that produce the same emotions, you said to yourself, let me remind myself of who I no longer want to be today. Let me become conscious of those unconscious thoughts that keep me returning back to the same self. I want to become so familiar with them that they would never slip by my awareness again. And what if you said, what behaviors do I demonstrate? What habits do I live by that keep me unconscious? And let me become conscious of how I act. And I want to become so aware of these states but I would never go unconscious again. And what if you said, what emotions that I've memorized that's become part of my identity? That's not who I am. It's a record of the past. Let me begin to look at those emotions and how do they drive other emotions and other thoughts and other behaviors. And you began to become conscious and familiar of the old self, and you were so familiar with it, you'd never go unconscious again. And you made the decision with such a firm intention of who you no longer wanted to be, that the energy of the decision overrode the emotion of the addiction that kept you as the same identity. And then you said, how would a great person think? What did Nelson Mandela know that I don't know? What did Einstein, Tesla know that I don't know? What did Buddha think about? And as you begin to think in new ways, and you begin to contemplate new ways of being, and you begin to explore and speculate new behaviors, you begin to make your brain work in new and unusual ways. And as you begin to make your brain work differently, you're changing your mind. Now, what if you became so involved with what you were thinking about that the thought in your mind literally became the experience? That's the privilege of being a human being, is that we can make thought more real than anything else. And so as you begin to speculate a new way of being and thought becomes the experience, what's the end product of an experience? An emotion. Your body literally begins to believe that that future event is happening to you now, and you literally physically change your brain and emotionally signal new genes in your body, and you're moving into a new state of being. And what if you said, I'm not getting up until I am this person? You would say, well, how much time do I have? I ask myself that question every day. And if you could move into that new state of being, would you agree then you would be broadcasting a whole new electromagnetic signature? Yes? And what if you were able to maintain that modified state of mind and body your entire day? Wouldn't you agree that something should show up differently in your world? Isn't that the law? That your brain is no longer a record of the past, but now it's in fact a map to the future? And you living in that state of being says that I'm greater than my environment, I'm greater than the addictions of the old body, and I'm out of my old line of time. I'm living in a whole new reality. The word meditation, the actual translation of the word meditation in Tibetan, literally means to become familiar with. That's it. That symbol means to become familiar with. So would you agree that if you were sitting down and you began to become familiar with those thoughts that are happening all the time behind the scenes of your awareness, and you eliminated the environment and you closed your eyes and you filled the room with space, with music, and you began to become conscious of your unconscious thoughts and familiar with your propensities and behaviors, and you began to become familiar with those emotions that you memorized, so familiar that you knew yourself, would you be meditating? Absolutely. To know thyself. Now, most people don't like to light a match in the dark place. This is the hardest part because this is the unlearning process. And if you began to become so conscious of those states of mind and body, is it possible that you would no longer be firing and wiring the same circuits in the same way because you would be observing them instead of participating in them? Yes? And if you no longer produce the same emotion connected to that thought, you would be no longer signaling the same gene that keeps creating the same condition in your body. And if you began to think of new ways of being, and you began to fire and wire those circuits, and you began to remind yourself every day who you do want to be, is it possible as you remind yourself and you fire and wire those circuits that it will begin to become familiar to you? Yes? Isn't that the principle in neuroscience? And if you allowed yourself to emotionally give thanks for the event of who you want to be ahead of the actual experience, what does gratitude or giving thanks mean? Your body begins to believe that the future event has already happened. Because when you give thanks, you mean it's already done, right? So you and I have been hypnotized and conditioned into believing we need a reason for joy. We need a reason to give thanks. That's the Newtonian model of reality, of cause and effect. Something outside of you changes how you feel inside of you. You notice you feel differently inside of you, and then you pay attention to whoever caused it. That's waiting for your environment to regulate how you feel. The quantum law says, I'm going to change the way I think and feel, and I'm going to cause an effect in my environment. So then can you give thanks ahead of the actual event, so much so that your body, as the unconscious mind, is convinced into believing that it's already happened. Now that's greatness. And when you do that, then, if you could reproduce that same level of mind and body over time, if you did that every day, is it possible that it would begin to become familiar to you? Yes? And if you got up thinking and feeling differently than when you started, would you agree then you're in a new state of being? And is a new state of being a new personality? Is a new personality a new personal reality? Yes? So, we have had people in the last 2.5 years that have done the workshops that we have taught pretty much around the world. And we have had people heal themselves of MS, heal themselves of lupus, rare genetic disorders, Hashimoto's syndrome, thyroid conditions. We had them heal themselves of cancers, of chronic pain, lots of food allergies and digestive disturbances, because they became somebody else. You with me? Now, your genes are as changeable as your brain. Now, you're geniuses, right? Poke the person next to you. Just poke them a little bit. So you're geniuses, right? So all organisms in nature interact with the environment, and your body is a protein-producing machine. Muscle cells make muscle proteins, they're called actin and myosin. Skin cells make skin proteins, they're called collagen and elastin. Stomach cells make stomach proteins, they're called enzymes. So your body's a protein-producing machine. You with me? And in order for your body to make, or a cell to make a protein, it needs to have a gene turned on. You still with me? So then if you're making proteins in cells, your genes are turned on to make those proteins. So then, if an organism is embracing at adverse conditions in the environment, and as it begins to interact with the environment and it experiences harsh conditions like temperature, it's cold, it's hot, altitude, current, predators, prey, all of that interaction in the environment begins to cause the organism through repeated exposures. If, let's say, for example, it's in a cold environment or an environment where there's predators, that if it's exposed to the same environmental conditions create the same emotions. Would you agree? Come on, yes? The same emotions are the same information from the environment. So the same emotion signals the same gene. But if the organism begins to change its behavior to produce a new experience, the new experience then produces a new emotion, and the new emotion is new information into the gene. You still with me? So then the organism over time begins to adapt to the environment, and as it begins to adapt to the environment, if it's cold, it begins to grow thicker fur. Fur is a protein. Or if it's in an altitude, it begins to have hemoglobin hold on to oxygen so that it can survive. And that happens in human beings. The Tibetans have a unique protein that allows the oxygen to stick to their hemoglobin. That's an epigenetic phenomenon. Or if the prey is being chased by the predator, over time it's going to begin to grow longer legs. Would you agree? It's a protein or a bigger fin to swim upstream. So the organism begins to interact with the environment, modifies its behavior. The new behavior creates a new experience. The new experience produces a new emotion, begins to signal a new gene in a new way, and the body begins to adapt and change. You with me? So then if you're thinking and feeling in the same way every day, you're beginning to signal the same gene over and over again. Would you agree? And there's no new information coming from the environment. And as you keep signaling the same gene over and over again, over and over again, over and over again, the gene begins to wear out because there's no new information coming in. And as the gene begins to wear out, it begins to make a cheaper protein, like taking a fax of a fax of a fax of a fax. It begins to become a little bit more molecularly unstable. So what happens when we age? What happens to your skin? It's protein. What happens to your hair? What happens to our bones? That's all protein. What happens to our enzymes? We start to make cheaper protein when we begin to age. So then, as we think and feel in the same cycle over and over again, we keep signaling the same gene, and as we keep turning on the same gene, we're keeping the same gene turned on and the other gene turned off. Now we're headed for our genetic destiny. How many people understand? So, is it possible then that if a person memorizes an emotion from something that's happened in their past, and they've become so familiar with that emotion that it's part of their identity that they just think that's who they are? So we had a middle-aged man who was diagnosed with cancer. And he was on an elevator, and he was getting ready to go to work, and he was going up the elevator, and he was standing next to a dermatologist. The dermatologist leans over and looks at his face, and he says, "Hey, you know what? Step off the elevator with me." And the dermatologist takes this man off the elevator, and he says, "Listen, my office is right down the hallway here. I want to talk to you. You have cancer on your face." And so this guy goes into the dermatologist. It's a malignant melanoma. They freeze it, they cut it out, and they radiate it. 4 months later, it grows back on his neck, even larger. He goes back, he gets it frozen, he gets it cut out, he gets it radiated. 4.5 months later, it grows back on his side, but this time it's even bigger. He goes back to the dermatologist. They freeze it, they cut it out, and they radiate it. Now, this guy had seen What the Bleep. He had read my first book. He had been to one of our level 1 workshops, and he had read, he's pretty well read in a couple other books and concepts about epigenetics. And he stopped and he said, "Now, what is this marble rolling around in my brain that keeps creating this condition?" So he packs up his bags and he takes his wife to Rosarita Beach in Mexico. He retreats from his familiar life that keeps turning on the same circuits in his brain to remind him who he thinks he is. And he sits on the beach and he says, "What emotion have I memorized that keeps signaling the same gene that's creating this disease?" And he begins to observe himself in his life. And he has the realization that he had spent the last 25 years of his life living in resentment. He became so used to living in resentment that that just is who he thought he was. He never even paid attention to it because the feeling became so familiar. How many people are with me? So he takes out a piece of paper and he says, "How do I think when I feel this way?" And he writes down for the whole day every thought that was driven by that emotion. He closes his eyes and he memorizes the entire list, so much so that he was like Gandalf on the bridge saying, "You may never pass again." And at the end of the day, when he had the whole list in his mind and he was completely familiar with all of those thoughts, he surrendered them into the quantum field and asked the quantum field to resolve it in a way that was right for him. Next day, goes back out on the beach, he sits under the palapa and he says, "What behaviors do I demonstrate when I live by this emotion? What do I say? How do I act?" And he sits down and he writes down everything he says and how he acts, makes this long list. And he reviews the list over and over again till he's got it completely committed to memory. Knows thyself. And as he becomes conscious of those unconscious programs at the end of the day, he surrenders it to the quantum field and asks it to resolve in a way that's perfect for him. Next day he goes out, he says, "Now, what emotions does this emotion drive?" And he begins to write down impatience and judgment and prejudice and envy, and he writes all these emotions, begins to observe himself. Now remember, the more he's observing himself, the more he's not the program, but he's the consciousness observing the program. Would you agree? He's objectifying his subjective mind. And at the end of the day, he surrenders those emotions. The next day he goes out, he does all three of them together again. He goes over the list over and over till he's got every single thought, every single behavior, every single emotion tapped out. Right around the 5th day, all of a sudden, guess what happens? He starts feeling really happy. Because why? He's no longer firing and wiring the same circuits. He's no longer emotionally signaling the body in the same way. He's no longer turning on the same gene. He's no longer producing the same behaviors that create the same emotions. And his body is all of a sudden becoming freed from the chains of those emotional addictions. And as he begins to feel free, he's liberating energy. He's no longer contracted. The body's no longer living in the past. And when the body breaks free from the chains of those emotional addictions, the side effect is called joy, because the body is liberating energy. So now he's got all this available energy, he's broadcasting a whole new signature, and he feels so good, he starts to naturally think about how he's going to be when he returns back into his life. He starts thinking about how he's going to act, what thoughts he does want to put his energy behind. He begins to rehearse new ways of being, and he starts to begin to think about how those experiences would feel. And he starts signaling new genes in new ways. He does it every day for 5 days. He walks back into his life after 10 days. He's in the shower the day of the surgery because the tumor grew back another time on his calf. That's what motivated him to do this again. But it was about the size of a lemon. And so on the day of that surgery, to have that tumor removed, he was in the shower, washing his hair, and he looks down, and the tumor fell off his leg. So then he took the tumor and he put it in a plastic bag, and he called the doctor's office. He said, "What do I do with this thing?" They said, bring it in, we want to see it." Now, new personality, new personal reality. Would you agree? The tumor existed in the old personality. He was somebody else. And he couldn't have that disease any longer because it was connected to the old emotion. His body was no longer living in the past, but now it was living in the future. How many people understand? So then as he began to emotionally feel differently, he began to literally turn on new genes that began to change his expression of self. And as he began to fire and wire new circuits, he was installing the new circuitry in his brain, the hardware, that he could use when he returned back into his life. His brain looked like the experience has already happened. His body was already emotionally being signaled as if the event was happening. He was already living in the future in the present moment. How many people are with me? That's what we do in our workshops. Now, my children are superb creators of reality. And they have always, from the time they were very young, had the opportunity to work on different things. And I encourage them to interact with the quantum field all the time. Now, my daughter is 22 years old, and she's probably the best creator that I have ever seen when it comes to creating unlimited things. And me as a parent, she always says, "Look, I want to do this or I want to do that." And I always say, "Really? How are you going to do that?" She's like, "What are you talking about? You taught me this." I'm like, "Oh, okay, sorry." So she had come home one summer, and she was going to spend the summer in the Northwest because there's no better place to spend the summer than the Northwest. And I said to her, in the kitchen, I said, "What do you want to create for the summer? You got plenty of time." She said, "I want an unlimited shopping spree." Now, what am I going to say to her? No? So I said to her, "Okay, here's the deal. Every day when you wake up in the morning, you have to close your eyes, and I want you to set an intention that you are going to have the most amazing shopping spree of your life. But here's the deal. You can't get up as the same person who sat down. You got to get up like you just shopped your brains out. And I want you to teach your body emotionally what it feels like to have an unlimited shopping spree. And I want your body to look like the event has already happened every day." She said, "No problem, Dad." And she practiced this for weeks on end through the summer. And I was in Washington, D.C., and I was in a cab going to this lecture. and my daughter calls me up. Now, when my daughter, or actually anybody, when we see miracles happen, we always ask our participants in our workshops to send us emails, because I love reading those emails. But the first line in every email always says the same thing. It always says, "You're not going to believe this." Everyone says it. My daughter's on the phone and she said, "Oh my God, Dad, you're not going to believe this." I can't even understand what she's saying, you know. I said, what? She said, "You know the unlimited shopping spree I was working on?" I said, "Yeah." She goes, "It happened today." I said, "All right, tell me everything. Don't leave anything out." She said, "Okay, I'm in Santa Monica, California with my friend, and we are in my favorite store in the promenade. And we're going through the racks, Dad, you know, rifling through the racks, looking at clothes, and all of a sudden, this man comes out and he says to my best friend, 'Hey, I think I know your father.' And, you know, he says, 'Is your father, you know, Sam Borelli?' 'Oh, yeah, that's my dad.' So he says, 'All right, you two, come with me.' So he takes the two girls, he walks them behind the counter, walks them through the back door. And then he said, 'Listen, your father did me a huge favor about 6 months ago, and I've been trying to think of a way to repay him back.' He said, 'I'm the owner of this store.' And he pulls out the company credit card. He said, 'Ladies, have a nice afternoon.'" So now I love to test my kids. So I don't say anything, and she, you know, there's a long pause on the cell phone, and she says, Dad? I said, "Yeah, I'm here." I said, "How much did you spend?" She said, "I spent $7,500 today." I said, "Are you guilty about that? You feel guilty about that?" She said, "Nope." And I said, "Never feel guilty for anything you create, good or bad." Now, I hung up the phone, and on the way back to the airport 2 days later, I called her up and I said, "How you doing? How's everything going?" She said, "Oh, great." You know, she's the type of kid that bought clothes for everybody, you know. She just is that type of kid. But she kept saying, "You know, the thing that I can't get beyond that is that it was my mind that created this thing." So my daughter has created trips to Italy and, you know, music videos. She's done all kinds of crazy things. But she loves doing it. And what she loves to do is she loves to move into a state of being and emotionally convince her body that it's already done. And then she gets up and she lives as if her prayers are already answered. And if you ask my daughter how she does it, she says, "I just move into a new state of being, and I would never try to figure out how it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. The moment I start to analyze how it's going to happen and when it's going to happen, I just return back to the old self." The new self would never think that way. And I said, "Say that again." So the universe organizes events in our life that are in a way that's just right for us. But the moment we try to predict the outcome, we get in the way again. Then you know that there's been research done on the physiology of tickling, right? Do you know that you cannot be tickled if you know where you're going to be tickled and when? So the universe wants to tickle you. It wants to take care of the wheres and the when. Your job is just to maintain that state of being. Live in a new personality. How many people understand? Now, can I go about 10 more minutes and then we'll take a break? Poke the person next to you. Come on, poke him. So then, we live in two states of mind. We either live in a state of survival or we live in a state of creation. Now, living in survival is living in stress. And stress is when your body's knocked out of homeostasis. Stress is when your body's knocked out of balance. The stress response is what your body innately does to return itself back to order. You with me? Now, you have three types of stress. You have physical stress, like trauma, accidents, injuries, falls. You have chemical stress, like flus and allergies and pesticides and pollutants and heavy metals and blood sugar levels and, that type of chemical imbalance, toxins. And then you have emotional stress. Traffic jams, internet connections, second mortgages, single parenting, 401ks, family tragedies. And your body is knocked out of balance in every single one of these things. You with me? Now, all organisms in nature are designed for short-term stress. Gazelle gets chased by a lion, and the gazelle outruns the lion. 15 minutes later, it goes back to grazing, and the body returns back to homeostasis. Now, human beings, do you know that we can turn on the stress response just by thought alone? We can begin to think about some worst-case scenario, and to the exclusion of everything else, we can focus on it to such a degree that we make the thought so real that the body begins to physiologically change as if the event was happening. We knock the body out of balance, and the body begins to believe that that future thing that we're focusing on is happening to us now. How many people are with me? Or we can unfold the past bitter memory that's tattooed in the recesses of our gray matter, and boom, and like magic, it comes to life, and in that moment it's real, and the body begins to believe it's in that past event. Now, as we begin to turn on that stress response, we're turning on a very primitive nervous system called the fight or flight nervous system, or what's called the sympathetic nervous system. And when we have a sympathetic reaction or a fight or flight reaction for some threat in our environment, real or imagined, we mobilize all of this energy. And as we mobilize all of this energy, the body's prepared for an emergency situation. Now here's the problem. Those emergency chemicals are highly addictive. And we begin to associate the problems and conditions in our life with our emotional addiction so that we can remember who we think we are as a somebody. In other words, the bad job, the terrible relationship, at least we can feel something. You know what I mean? Now, think about this. Those chemicals, by a scientific fact, the hormones of stress, over time, long-term stress response. In other words, when you turn on the stress response and you can't turn it off, now you're headed for a disease. Because it's a scientific fact that the chemicals of stress long-term push the genetic buttons and down-regulate or dysregulate genes that create disease. Now think about this. Well, you just said that you agreed with me that you understood that your thoughts, actually you can turn on the stress response just by thinking about things, yes? And you also agreed that the chemicals of stress can actually push the genetic buttons that create disease. So when you agree then that it's possible that your thoughts can actually make you sick, yes? So if your thoughts can make you sick because they can turn on the stress response, is it possible that your thoughts make you well? So, those emotions that are created from the hormones of stress are these emotions: anger, aggression, hatred, prejudice, frustration, fear, anxiety, depression, hopelessness, insecurity, powerlessness. Those are all driven by the hormones of stress. And that's what psychology calls normal states of consciousness. Those are the altered states of consciousness. And those emotions do something really amazing. They endorse the ego. And as they endorse the ego begins to become selfish, self-involved, self-centered, self-indulging, self-aggrandizing, full of self-pity. It's all about the self. Now, when the gazelle is being chased by the lion, she's only concerned about three things. You know what she's concerned about? My body. I got to take care of my body. Where in my environment am I going to go? And how much time do I have to get there? The body, the environment, and time. Now, when you and I live by the hormones of stress, we obsess about our bodies. You know what I mean? Hairstyles, what you look like, overweight, underweight. We obsess about things in your environment that you own or you don't own. We obsess about or become over-focused about time, because those chemicals of stress cause us to begin to believe that we are a body in this environment living in linear time, and that's not who we are. Because those chemicals cause us to begin to function as materialists. And the self is something beyond the body in this environment and time. Now, the atom is 99.9999 with 13 zeros after it, percent nothing. It's empty space, it's energy, it's frequency. It's 0.0 with 12 zeros behind it with a 1 on the end, percent particle. And that particle only exists as a momentary phenomenon, and then it disappears. So you're moving in and out of the quantum field 7.8 times per second. And you're actually more energy than you are particle. Poke the person next to you. Don't they feel real? So now, when those hormones of stress are running, you and I as quantum observers are focusing on the particle and not on the potential. You with me? And so, when you are in a creative state, you know what's so amazing? When you're living in this state of stress, you feel separate from possibility, would you agree? And you're trying to force and control outcomes in your life. But when you're in a state of creation, something unusual happens. When you're truly creating, you forget about yourself. Don't you? You're so involved with what you're doing that you become nobody. You become no thing. You become no time. You become pure consciousness. And we have all the biological machinery to do this. And when you become truly present in that moment, in what you are doing, to the degree that you're no longer your identity, there's a physiological change that takes place in the brain where your forebrain begins to control the hindbrain, begins to quiet down the circuits in the rest of the brain that have to do with your body, the environment, and time, and you become pure consciousness. And the moment that happens, your brain captures the thought as the experience and begins to rewire the brain to look like the experience has already happened. And isn't it ironic that when we go from being selfish to being selfless, we lay down the ego and we become pure consciousness? Only when we are pure consciousness can we walk through the door to the quantum field. You can't enter as a somebody, you gotta enter as a nobody. And isn't it ironic then that in order to have some type of control over your body, you want to change something about your body, you want to change something in your life or your environment, you want to have dominion over time, you want to change a new line of time, we have to forget about our bodies, we have to forget about our environment, and we have to forget about time in order to have dominion over them. How many people are with me? Now, when you and I are in that elegant state of creation, we're no longer thinking and feeling and feeling and thinking in that same cycle, and we're no longer turning on these hormonal centers. And if you literally are no longer there, you are absent, you're pure consciousness, you forget about you, then you're no longer signaling these hormonal centers, and that energy begins to move somewhere, and guess where it moves? Right into your heart. Now, this is not a metaphysical concept, this is pure physiology. When you begin to fall in love with your creation, you want the moment to last. And the moment that happens, you are literally signaling new genes in new ways, and your body's beginning to change. But most people wait for what? Crisis or trauma or disease or loss or diagnosis to really want to change. They wait to the point where the ego is brought to such a low level that they cannot go on business as usual any longer. That's when we begin to look at how we're thinking or what we believe or how we act or our attitude or what emotions we're living by. And my message is, why wait? We can learn and change in a state of pain and suffering, which tends to be the human model, or we can learn and change in a state of joy and inspiration. Now, you want to learn the hardest part about all of this? You ready? The hardest part of all of this. The hardest part of all of this is making the time to do it. That's it. That's it. Making time for your precious self. Waking up in the morning and beginning to think about a new possibility that exists in the quantum field. And as your brain begins to speculate new ways of being, the frontal lobe looks out over the landscape of the entire brain, and it begins to turn on certain circuits that you learned intellectually and other networks of neurons that you've experienced, and seamlessly piece this knowledge and experience together to create a new level of mind. And as it begins to do that, you are actually tuning in to a possibility that exists in the quantum field. Now, when is self-love born? You think self-love is born when you get a manicure or a pedicure, or you buy yourself a sports car? That's not self-love, that's pleasure. You know when self-love is born? When you're sitting down and your body is raging and it's trying to unseat you, telling you that you can't do it, or beginning to send signals back to your brain. And as it begins to do that, and you're sitting there, instead of giving into it, you say to your body, "That's all you got? That's your best? You know what? I'm going to wait till you're done. And then I'm going to recondition you to a new mind, and you're going to be so happy that you're happy." Because right on the other side of your fear is courage. It's the same energy. Right on the other side of your pain is freedom. Right on the other side of your sadness is bliss. It's the same energy. It's just trapped in the body. And so when you're living in survival, feeling separate from possibility, focusing on the particle instead of possibility or the wave, and you're using your senses to define reality, we're materialists. But when you move into an elevated emotion and you begin to get beyond that state, and your body is freed from the chains of those emotions, and you've overcome some aspect of yourself, you feel liberated. You're focusing on the 99.9999% possibility. You're no longer focusing on the particle, and you feel connected to something greater, and you trust in the outcome because you know that you've already experienced it. Now, I call that the natural state of being. That's a natural state of being. That's the normal state of consciousness, and those stress hormones are the altered state of consciousness. And when you and I begin to change the things about ourselves that we don't like in the world, you know what I'm talking about, right? You can't say you want peace, in the world, and then, be at odds with your neighbor, drive down the freeway, hey, that's mind doing one thing and body doing something else. You don't like the way politics works, where they're taking from people, start giving. We have to demonstrate all the changes we want to see in the world, to go from thinking to doing to being. Because you can get a group of meditators to focus on peace, and it'll absolutely lower crime rates in a community. It's a scientific fact. But when those people are done meditating and they leave the community, what happens? Returns right back to the ceiling level. It's not enough to just think it. We have to demonstrate it. And when you demonstrate greatness in any area of your life, you give people permission to do the same. Would you agree? So as you begin to liberate energy, your body goes from being more particle to more wave. And you liberate energy. Now you have available energy to begin to observe a new destiny with. And you're observing that destiny with your own energy. And you are taking waves of possibility and collapsing them into an event called an experience in your life. And I'm so happy to say that I'm not even here to convince you that it's possible. I already know it's possible. I mean, we just came from London this past, what's today? Wednesday? I got home on Monday, and we were teaching an advanced workshop there. Boy, there were so many miraculous things that happened to people. We had a lady that was exposed to a bacteria 15 years ago. And she was from London, and the bacteria on some level, according to the doctors, would never leave her body. She couldn't eat certain foods. She couldn't eat gluten. She couldn't eat wheat. She couldn't eat anything. She was living on a limited diet of fruits and vegetables. That's it. And she couldn't travel, because anytime she traveled, of course, there was no food that she could eat. And then her blood sugar would go down and she'd be further out of balance. And she came to our advanced training in Colorado last month. And like magic, all of a sudden, she's eating anything she wants. Now, you think she's a happy person? I think that's the greatest compliment you could ever give me, is when people have some type of personal breakthrough and they're free now. They're no longer the same personality. So then living by the same emotion every single day means nothing new is happening in our life. Would you agree? And living in those emotional states that keep us connected to those lower frequency emotions, that keep us focusing on particle or physical matter instead of possibility, living by those states over time signals the same gene in the same way, and that's what begins to create our genetic diseases. Is it possible then, as we begin to unmemorize that emotion and the body begins to become free, then you see possibilities that you never saw before because the filter of the emotion's been removed and you're no longer looking at your life from your past. You're seeing possibility again. How many people are with me? So, the greatest part of all of this is that there's an intelligence that's within you that's giving you life. Your heart beats over 2 gallons of blood per minute, over 100 gallons of blood in 1 hour, over 100,000 times in one day through 60,000 miles of blood vessels. You keeping track of that? Or is there some intelligence that's giving you life? That in every single second, you lose 25 million cells. Oh, you just made another 25 million. Were you keeping track of that? 7-item shopping list is usually enough. That in one cell of your body, it goes through the order of 100,000 chemical reactions in 1 second. Multiply that by the 70 trillion or 100 trillion cells that make up your body. Are you keeping track of that? As a matter of fact, the information, in order for that to take place, happens faster than the speed of light, which means you are now a quantum factor. That your body is gravitationally organized energy. That's all it is. Sending and receiving information. Now that intelligence that's giving you life is the same intelligence that's causing supernovas to be born in distant galaxies, that's causing a lily to bloom right now, keeping the planets rotating around the sun. It's both personal and universal. It's within you and all around you. And few people ever take time to interact with this intelligence, to develop a relationship with it, and say to it, you know what? I'm emulating you as a creator today. I'm going to emulate you. I'm going to observe something into my life, just like you observe all of this into life. I'm a child of God. I've taken time out of my day to do this. So listen, if I make contact with you, I'm tired of this one-way thing, you know? We need a two-way relationship here. I need to know that you're paying attention to my efforts, so you got to show me a sign so that I know without a doubt it's come from you. And as we begin to have these synchronistic events happen in your life, the side effect of that is called empowerment. And independent of your race, the color of your skin, your gender, your culture, your intellectual ability, independent of all these things that we think we're separate from, this intelligence is bleeding through you. And independent of it, nobody is so special to be excluded from this phenomenon. We all have the power to do it. No race, no culture, no gender is superior. That if you're alive and you have a human brain, this is what we do. We're creators. So as we begin to remove the masks and the layers that block the flow of this divine intelligence within us, those emotions that we memorize, those habits, those neurological hardwired networks, as we begin to clean them away and remove them layer by layer, this intelligence begins to leak out of us. It begins to move through us. It begins to consume us. Its nature becomes our nature. Its mind is now our mind. We are beginning to interact with it. And as we begin to interact with it, we become more like it. We become more loving. That's its mind. That's what it does. It loves us in the life. We become more giving. It gives life. We become more conscious. It's the consciousness. We become more willful. It's will. We become more creative. Its mind is now our mind. And we begin to express a greater consciousness through us. That's our purpose in life. Our purpose in life isn't to be good or to please God or do the right thing or be successful or beautiful. That's not our purpose. Our purpose is to begin to express this intelligence through us. And as we begin to interact with it and connect with it and we begin to see evidence that it is real, and you break through of some limitation about yourself, and you are overjoyed that you are now free, there's only one thing you'll want to do when you feel that way. And you know what that is, don't you? You want to give. You say, I feel so incredible about myself and about life. Here, I don't need this. Take it. I want you to feel how I'm feeling. We go from living instead of selfishly to selflessly. And when we make decisions, we always consider the whole. Great time to be alive in history, wouldn't you agree? I think we all negotiated to be here. And this is a time in history where we have to shine. And this is the time in history where we have to be the living example. And when you and I do, we give people permission all around us to do the same. And when we begin to see through the illusions of all of this, and we begin to give ourselves our own empowerment, don't you agree then that all of a sudden we become free from corporations and politics, and we were living in a whole different state of being? Thanks for listening.